Solicito a atenção de todos para a entrada das autoridades. Ingressa no auditório Duque de Caxias o senhor General de Exército, André Luiz Novaes Miranda, assessor especial da Diretoria Internacional da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, operações terrestres. General de Divisão, Fernando Bartolomeu Fernandes, diretor de Educação Superior Militar. General de Divisão, Marcos de Sá Afonso da Costa, antigo comandante da missão da Organização das Nações Unidas para a Estabilização na República Democrática do Congo e pesquisador da Rede Brasileira sobre Operações de Paz. O embaixador Marcelo Marota Viegas, diretor do Departamento de Organismos Internacionais do Ministério das Relações Exteriores, acompanhado pelo General de Brigada Carlos Alberto Moutinho Vaz, comandante da Escola de Comando e Estado-Maior do Exército. A palestra magna do evento será proferida pelo Dr. Cedric de Coning, do Instituto Norueguês de Assuntos Internacionais, com o tema Operações de Paz Adaptativas. Convido os presentes a entoarem o hino nacional brasileiro, música de Francisco Manuel da Silva e letra de Joaquim Osório Duque Estrada.
Desafio nosso peito à própria morte. Ó pátria magna, idolatrada, salve, salve. Brasil, um sonho intenso, um raio vívido de amor e de esperança a terra desce. Sem teu formoso céu risonho e límpido, a imagem do cruzeiro resplandece. Gigante pela própria natureza, és velho, és forte, quadro do colosso, e teu futuro espelha essa grandeza, terra dourada, entre outras mil és tu, Brasil, ó pátria amada, dos filhos desse sol és mãe, gente, pátria amada, Brasil.
Queiram sentar-se. O comandante da ECEME fará uso da palavra.
Senhor General Novaes, antigo comandante de operações terrestres, senhor General Fernandes, diretor de Educação Superior Militar, nosso comandante, senhor General de Divisão Afonso da Costa, antigo comandante do componente militar, Force Commander, da Missão das Nações Unidas para a Estabilização da República Democrática do Congo, senhor embaixador Marcelo Viegas, diretor do Departamento de Organismos Internacionais do MRE. Ao cumprimentá-los, eu gostaria de estender aqui a minha saudação a todas as autoridades aqui presentes, aos nossos convidados, aos nossos painelistas e moderadores, muitos dos quais viajaram de muito longe e ainda estão sob o efeito de um grande jet lag, mas que atenderam ao nosso convite e cujas presenças engrandecem muito o nosso evento. Senhoras e senhores integrantes da nossa Escola Marechal Castelo Branco, eu faço também uma saudação às pessoas que assistem à transmissão ao vivo do nosso evento pelos nossos canais digitais. Hoje é mais um dia de extrema importância na nossa Escola Marechal Castelo Branco, pois temos o privilégio de sediar um evento que seguramente será de alto nível e uma jornada e meia muito produtivas para todos nós. Como o senhor General Novaes, antigo instrutor dessa casa, vai se recordar seguramente, é muito comum que nas nossas sessões de instrução a gente faça a ligação com a sessão anterior. E neste caso eu gostaria de fazer uma ligação com um evento que tivemos aqui no mês de março, que foi a nossa jornada de geopolítica mundial, onde nós, aproveitando o início do ano letivo dos diversos cursos dessa casa e aproveitando que talvez, infelizmente, a situação geopolítica internacional esteja em um momento extremamente conturbado, trouxemos aqui o coronel Luquez, que é o chefe da nossa cadeira de geopolítica na ECEME, os nossos professores do Instituto Meira Mattos, e debatemos, e mostramos ao nosso, não somente ao público interno, mas a muitos convidados, os desafios que a geopolítica do presente apresenta a todos os atores internacionais relevantes, dentre os quais o Brasil. Infelizmente, de lá para cá, a situação não melhorou muito, pelo contrário, a gente tem testemunhado o agravamento de crises e conflitos que têm acontecido pelo mundo, e esse é um tema, seguramente, de muito interesse para todos nós. O evento que nós vamos iniciar nesse momento, nosso Ciclo de Estudos Estratégicos, tem um tema que eu considero de grande pertinência para o Brasil. Começamos com o Brasil e a transformação das operações de paz. As senhoras e senhores sabem que o Brasil tem uma tradição consolidada de participação em operações de paz. Com certeza a face mais visível seria a nossa participação militar, até pelos números que nós temos, mas nós nunca podemos esquecer também do Sérgio Vieira de Mello, Luiz Carlos da Costa, brasileiros que, inclusive, perderam as suas vidas no Iraque, no Haiti e em tantos outros locais, representando o nosso país nas operações de paz. Essa tradição ela é, como disse, consolidada e seguramente irá perdurar no futuro. E aí colocamos o multilateralismo entre a crise e a afirmação da resiliência. A crise do multilateralismo é patente, nós conversamos sobre isso na nossa jornada de geopolítica, e isso não é uma avaliação nossa. Nós trouxemos aqui discursos que foram proferidos no Fórum Econômico Mundial de Davos, ainda nesse ano, discursos e apresentações do próprio secretário-geral das Nações Unidas e muitos outros fatos e apresentações que corroboram essa situação geopolítica mundial que coloca o multilateralismo, mais uma vez, em um momento de crise ou de inflexão e cuja resiliência terá que ser afirmada. Isso é um tema, nós trouxemos o nosso evento para uma perspectiva brasileira, isso é um tema de alto interesse para o Brasil, talvez a junção desses assuntos para o nosso país, que é um membro fundador da Organização das Nações Unidas. Se nós observarmos os princípios constantes do capítulo 4 da Constituição do artigo 4º da Constituição do Brasil, onde lá estão os princípios que regem as relações internacionais do nosso país, nós observamos muito claramente tópicos que nos remetem diretamente à Carta das Nações Unidas, como por exemplo, a solução pacífica dos conflitos, além da não intervenção, da defesa da paz, dentre outros. E ainda hoje, a quem já teve a curiosidade, por exemplo, de observar a mensagem presidencial que foi enviada ao Congresso Nacional neste ano, na abertura do ano legislativo, se a gente for ao capítulo 7 daquele documento, que fala sobre relações internacionais, soberania e defesa, se nós fizermos ali uma nuvem de palavras, talvez o que vai aparecer com maior destaque seja exatamente multilateralismo, cooperação, diálogo. Então essas são as palavras que vão aparecer. Igualmente, quando a gente fala em operações de paz, além da tradição já consolidada no passado, quando a gente analisa os documentos de defesa do Brasil, particularmente as editadas há pouco tempo, Política Nacional de Defesa e Estratégia Nacional de Defesa, a gente consegue identificar objetivos nacionais de defesa, particularmente número 7 e número 8, que fala de segurança regional, defesa dos interesses brasileiros no exterior. A gente observa objetivos, estratégias, ações estratégicas relacionadas à participação brasileira em operações de paz, e por esse motivo essa discussão é tão relevante no Brasil e mais ainda na nossa escola, onde nós nos dedicamos diariamente a tratar dos temas de defesa e também de segurança internacional. A gente ainda não consegue, professor Cedric, identificar qual será o futuro das operações de paz. Há quem aposte que vamos ter uma preponderância do capítulo 8 da Carta das Nações Unidas, que fala dos arranjos regionais. Esse pode ser um caminho. A gente não consegue ter certeza, mas o que a gente imagina é que, com o mundo altamente conflagrado como nós temos no dia de hoje, de alguma maneira, quando nós tivermos um cessar-fogo, tivermos uma situação de estabilidade nos conflitos existentes, algum arranjo será necessário para que se obtenha e mantenha uma situação de paz duradoura, que é o grande objetivo não somente das Nações Unidas, como das demais organizações que se destinadas à segurança internacional. Então nós não sabemos como será, mas o que nós sabemos é que, seja como for, muito provavelmente o Brasil terá um engajamento, um envolvimento direto, como faz parte da nossa tradição. Então é com essas palavras que eu gostaria de abrir o nosso evento, sem antes deixar de cumprimentar e agradecer a todas as pessoas que tornaram esse evento possível. Aqui dentro da ECEME nós temos, como eu sempre digo, o nosso braço de pesquisa e pós-graduação, que é o Instituto Meira Mattos, um adolescente prestes a completar 14 anos, mas que já presta um grande serviço ao Brasil, à nossa escola. Nós temos dentro do Instituto nosso programa de pós-graduação em ciências militares, alguns laboratórios de pesquisa, dentre os quais o LabPop, o nosso laboratório de pesquisa sobre operações de paz, que com muita competência teve o protagonismo na organização desse evento. Gostaria de cumprimentar aqui a toda a equipe do LabPop. Vejo professores, pesquisadores, mestrandos, doutorandos, parabéns e muito obrigado pelo trabalho de vocês na organização desse evento. Gostaria também de agradecer aos nossos patrocinadores e apoiadores, a nossa Rebrapaz, a Rede Brasileira sobre Operações de Paz. Muito obrigado, doutora Eduarda, e a toda a equipe da Rebrapaz. A nossa Biblioteca do Exército, sempre uma grande parceira nos nossos eventos e que mais uma vez montou o seu estande. A nossa Poupex, Associação de Poupança e Empréstimo do Exército Brasileiro. Muito obrigado mais uma vez pelo apoio. E a nossa FAPERJ, a nossa Fundação Carlos Chagas Filho, de Amparo à Pesquisa do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, foi também uma grande parceira para a organização desse evento, inclusive nos proporcionando trazer conferencistas, painelistas e moderadores vindo de diversas regiões do nosso planeta. Mais uma vez, muito obrigado a todos pela presença e, com isso, vamos iniciar essa jornada e meia seguramente muito produtiva para todos nós. Muito obrigado.
Sua palestra.
Bom dia. Good morning, Commandant, Generals, Senior Officers, Ambassadors, Professors. It's a really great honor to be here with you this morning and to have the opportunity to actually kick us off and start this conversation that we're going to have for the next day and a half. So fantastic opportunity for me to be here with you, and thank you very much. My name is Cedric de Coning. I'm a research professor with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. I've been working there for the last 20 years, focusing on United Nations peacekeeping, peace operations, peace building, mediation, and issues related to international conflict resolution. And I'm originally from South Africa, so before that I was a South African diplomat. I was a United Nations peacekeeper in East Timor, where I had the opportunity to serve under Sergio Vero de Mello. I was also working for a period for the United Nations headquarters in New York in peacekeeping operations training, and had many opportunities over the years to visit different peace operations and to provide different advice to peacekeeping operations in terms of specific initiatives that we've developed. I'll share some of that whilst I talk to you as well. Worked with many wonderful Brazilian peacekeepers over the years. Most recently, together with General Santos de Cruz, we did a recommendation for the Security Council on the future of peace operations in Somalia. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to work with many of you and your colleagues over the years. So I've been asked to talk this morning to you about adaptive peace operations. And the idea with adaptive peace operations is really how are we changing, adapting to the changing circumstances that we find ourselves in. The Commandant spoke about the special moment we find ourselves in at the moment in the world and what the implications are for that of peace operations as well. So I'll say a few words about the major adaptations that we have, of course, experienced in the past before we found ourselves in the situation we are in now. But then I will also talk about the particular challenges of the moment that we're in. What are we adapting to right now? Focusing on both the changing nature of conflict that we are adapting to, but also, of course, the changing global order and a few other key developments in terms of the environment, climate change, new technologies, and so forth. And then I will talk about that in terms of the implications for peace operations and how that is creating a kind of a compounding crisis for the United Nations peacekeeping operations at this very moment in time. And then we'll talk about what are the implications for that about the future of peace operations. And lastly, I will end up talking a bit about if we're thinking about adaptive peace operations, not just as something we have to do, but as something that we plan to do as part of our doctrine of peace operations. What are the methodologies and the implications of that? So that's what I plan to share with you in the next 35 minutes or so. So let's quickly just start off by thinking a little bit about how peace operations have changed over time. We all know peacekeeping wasn't something that was in the UN Charter. It was an innovation. It was an adaptation to the crisis the United Nations faced in 1948 in the Suez Canal. And now we're back with the Strait of Hormuz. We seem to be hovering around that piece of geography through all the crises over the years and adaptations. But that has kicked off the initial period of peacekeeping operations during the Cold War, which was essentially around ceasefire observation or observation of peace operations, adapting originally from small observer-type missions to lightly armed peacekeeping operations. And today we have 11 peace operations in the world, of which 7 is still this type of ceasefire operation. So they are still with us, but we seem to have forgotten them over the years when we started focusing much more on multidimensional peace operations. I think we are returning or finding ourselves in some kind of a Cold War again. And so these ceasefire observer missions is something which we need to restudy and revisit also in our training, in our education, because it's the kind of operations where we are likely to be more involved again in the future. And then at the end of the Cold War, which was another pivotal moment, somewhat similar to what we are experiencing now in terms of a major transition in the global order, but maybe one that we experienced as something more positive than where we are now. But then we had this significant change in peacekeeping operations from small, traditional ceasefire-type operations to large, multidimensional peacekeeping operations that essentially assisted countries with implementing comprehensive peace operations, so peace agreements. And that evolved over time. We had transitional administration. So for instance, when I was in Timor-Leste, it was when the UN was as the transitional administration, the temporary government, if you like, of Timor-Leste, coming between the conflict and the independence. And we had that, of course, also in Kosovo. That mission is also one of the missions that are still continuing. And then more recently, we had a shift into what we can call stabilization operations. We'll talk more about them in a little while. But it has been another adaptation where we shifted away from focusing mostly on implementing peace agreements to essentially protecting civilians and protecting the state against insurgents. And today we have quite a few experiences with what we call support operations. So this is the United Nations providing support to the African Union in Somalia, or to the SADC mission in the Congo, or to the G5 Sahel operation, or in some form, perhaps different from the others, but also currently in the gang suppression force in Haiti. So it's more a situation where another region or organization or grouping is taking the lead, but the United Nations is supporting them because we have developed over these years a significant capacity to support and deploy peace operations, the logistics of it, the political framework of it, which is unsurpassed in any other organization in the world. So the point here is our whole history of peace operations is a history of adaptations through crises over the years. It's not something new that we are finding ourselves in. We are maybe finding ourselves in a particular volatile moment, but peace operations is not only something that is an adaptation and innovation in of itself out of the United Nations Charter, but it has been part of our identity of peace operations that we have continuously evolved. One of the ways in which we did that has been through major reviews. We had the Brahimi Review in 2000, which came out of the crises of the 1990s, the genocide in Rwanda, the failure of the UN missions in Somalia, the trouble with the UN mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then we had the high-level panel on peace operations in 2014, 2015, which really reminded us that peace operations is not an end in and of itself. And when we make peace operations an end in and of itself, when we use peace operations to solve a problem, it usually fails. Because peace operations is very effective when it supports a political process. But if there's no viable political process, if there's no viable peace project, then the peace operations can't change the realities of the situation by just us being there on the ground. And the panel also reminded us, especially in today's world, of the importance of partnerships, because we find that we now have the African Union, we have the European Union, we have many other regional organizations and other bodies with capacity. So it's rarely that we will find a situation today where the United Nations is dealing with a particular conflict on its own. It will always do so together with many others. And so partnerships are key. And lastly, the high-level panel on peace operations reminded us about the importance of the people we are protecting, the people we are helping with the peace process. Because this can so easily become something which we are focused on as a doctrine, as an entity. We are spending so much time planning and organizing. We are reporting back to headquarters. We are reporting back to our countries. We become so busy with ourselves. We become so busy with managing a peace operation that we lose sight of all of this is actually to help make people more safe, to protect people, to help a society to achieve sustainable peace. So this was another important message of the high-level panel on peace operations, and one that is something that we will come back to again because it's critical also for the moment that we're in. But currently, we are also in the process of a major review of all forms of the future of peace operations. And we are all eagerly awaiting the results of this review, which we now expect to come out in June. And this was a review that was tasked to the Secretary General of the United Nations by the Pact of the Future, out of the Summit of the Future. This was a major meeting in 2024 when all the countries came together to take a strategic vision of, in this world where we are in the crisis that we are in, where are we going, what should be the major directions that we take. And one of the decisions of the Pact of the Future, out of the Summit of the Future, was that this review has to take place. And this review is a kind of a strategic review that looks very much at some of the issues we will be discussing today and tomorrow. Right? What does the future of UN peace operations look like? What steps should we take now to ensure that we are fit for purpose for the kind of futures we may expect? As the Commandant said, none of us can look in the crystal ball and know exactly what is coming. But we know that whatever is coming, there's certain things we can do in preparation now. We need to have certain capacities in place. We need to have the ability to plan. We need to be able to do foresight and strategic planning. We need to be able to retain the basic capacities in our countries, like you are doing now, but also at the United Nations headquarters, to plan for those missions that may come. We don't know what the exact demands will be, but we know what it requires to plan for those operations. And so there are many things that we can do, even without knowing exactly what the future will hold. And as that first slide shows that I started with, nobody knew in 1948 or nobody knew in 1980, what the next step will be. But there's always been a next step, and we've always managed to cope with that uncertainty. So let's look then at what are some of the major changes that we can anticipate we are dealing with now, that we are forced to deal with, right? I mentioned that we have had adaptations in the past. Essentially, we moved from a period of dealing with conflict between countries in the Cold War through the ceasefire of observer missions, to in the period after the Cold War, when we had these large multidimensional peace operations. Most of them were peace agreements reached between states and rebel groups. So it was civil wars, in a sense, that we helped to bring to an end. And then more recently, in the last 20 years or so, we see not so much civil wars, but we see insurgencies by violent extremist groups, many cases religiously inspired jihadist violent extremist groups that are challenging their governments. And so our peace operations adapted to that, and we developed these stabilization operations that I spoke in the past. But not just violent extremist groups recognized through, let's say, religious inspiration, but we also had, of course, in Haiti, criminalized gangs, and even in the other places where we have this kind of insurgencies, the organized crime is a major element of sustaining these types. So This is the kind with and that we are likely to some degree to see also in the future, at least in the immediate future, in terms of the type of operations that we are dealing with. This has changed peacekeeping fundamentally, from conflict resolution to conflict management. In other words, no longer are we focusing in these operations on implementing a peace agreement, because there is no peace agreement, and mediating a conflict between two parties, because we don't recognize the violent extremist groups as a party to negotiate with. So we are suddenly in a situation where we have only one party, the state, that we are protecting against an insurgency group. And our focus has shifted from resolving a conflict, from implementing a peace agreement, to now protecting civilians and protecting the state against these countries. So we've had this transformation from peace to protection. That also meant that peacekeeping operations changed a lot in the last few years, from what I would term from blue to green. Peacekeeping is blue helmets, white vehicles, like we saw in the video during your national anthem, because peacekeeping is not meant to be a war-fighting machine. It is meant to be a third-party interposition between two sides. And therefore, we wanted to paint our vehicles white, we wanted to wear blue helmets, so everybody can see us. We are here, we are the neutral party. We are here to stand between the two of you to stop you from fighting. We don't want to surprise you, we agree with you beforehand what we are going to do. But now we find ourselves in these stabilization operations in a situation where the one party don't recognize us as beneficial, as neutral. They see us as part of the problem. They see us as part of imperialism or the West, or because we are the United Nations. And therefore we are legitimate targets. And we find active fighting, combat, in some cases, between peacekeepers and these extremist groups. And so that is why you see these vehicles. This was of the British Expeditionary Force in Mali. And more peacekeeping starting to no longer operate in white vehicles or with blue berets, but as we saw also in MONUSCO, operating at night, operating with camouflage, undertaking active operations against a rebel group like M23 in the Congo. So this has brought about a fundamental shift in how we think about peace operations, and still one that is very controversial. Many member states still resisting that change. And the result is, in a place like Mali, where we had a huge number of casualties, that nations prepare their peacekeepers for peacekeeping and deploy them to a peacekeeping operation, because it's still called peacekeeping for political reasons. And then when they find themselves on the ground, they find themselves in this situation, and we find the kind of high casualties that we've seen in Mali. So I think still a significant challenge that we are dealing with. There's one particular problem when it comes to stabilization that I want to highlight, that I call the stabilization dilemma. And I think it explains in part the crisis we find ourselves in now. Because the more successful we are as peacekeepers to stabilize a particular situation where there's a conflict between an insurgency group and a host state, the less reason there is, the less motive or incentive there is for that host state to find the kind of political solutions with the rebel groups or the politics they represent that can bring a sustainable peace to the country. Because we are solving the problem for them. We are taking the stone out of the shoe. The more successfully we are with stabilization, why will they change the politics? They are the elites, they are in power. Why should they share power with someone else if that other elite group, other part of the society with which they are in conflict with, we as the international peacekeepers are keeping under control. And so we end up in conflicts that are now 20 years in the Congo, 10 years in Mali, etc., right? Because these conflicts never end, because we're doing enough to stabilize it, but the politicians don't want to change the gravy train that they are in, and so we end up just being stuck, and we don't have any control over our exit strategy, because we are stuck in protecting and stabilizing instead of focusing on solving the political problem. And of course, many of these host states don't want to recognize that there's a political problem, right? For them, it's, oh, there's foreign terrorists, or there's some other problem that is not us. It's not something we have to solve. It's, part of the international terrorism, and therefore you have to help us to deal with that. And that means that we end up in this situation where we are perpetually staying and doing the same job over and over again. One of the challenges also, I think, from a kind of a military perspective in this context, is that we are rarely given enough resources to really deal effectively with the insurgents. We did that with the M23 in 2012, 2013. That was a really interesting period of UN peacekeeping operations when there was a politically coherent moment amongst the Security Council members, the regional countries, the neighbors. Everybody agreed on what to do, and we had the political will and the military capability to deal with M23 at that time. But then the politics changed again. And if we're in a situation where we are tasked to stabilize, we are tasked to disrupt an insurgent group, but we don't have enough capacity to actually defeat them, or it's not our mandate, then we're only making that group stronger and stronger, because we're putting them under pressure, so they are learning, they are adapting to what we are doing, but we don't actually destroy them at any moment in time, right? So we are just making them stronger the longer we are there. We're making them better, more robust, more resilient the longer we are there. So these are some of the unintended consequences, I think, of the shift to protection and stabilization, which I think has resulted in part informing a kind of a perception among member states, among countries in the Security Council, that UN peacekeeping is not working. UN peacekeeping were very effective when we were implementing peace processes, but UN peacekeeping is not very effective in places like the Congo or Mali or Central African Republic in bringing those conflicts or resolving those conflicts, bringing those conflicts to an end. And it's because that is not the job of peacekeeping. It's the job of the diplomats and the peacemakers to bring the conflict to an end. The role of peace operations is to implement those peace processes. And where we've had the opportunity to do that, we've done that very well. But when we are just tasked to stabilize a situation because nobody is able to resolve it, then of course that is not something that anybody is going to be able to do effectively. Luckily, one of the things we've seen as a result of this frustration building up with these type of operations is that there's now quite a significant shift. Already since 2014, there's been no new large peacekeeping operations. And instead of deploying these kind of operations, we see smaller political missions being deployed, what we call special political missions. So there is some learning and adaptation also when it comes to dealing with this particular problem. Although we still have, of course, our missions in the Central African Republic and our missions in the Congo that will wrap up over the next coming years. But some of these lessons have not been learned. I think of Haiti, for instance, with a gang suppression force. I mean, we know from the high-level panel on peace operations, we know from these experiences that I'm sharing with you now, that without a political problem, we can't solve a problem militarily, right? Just with the gang suppression force. We can suppress the gangs, maybe, but what next? If the governance doesn't change, if the politics doesn't change. So the focus has to be on the political and on the diplomatic sphere. I think too often, especially in the Security Council, missions are mandated and then they're like a shoot and forget missile. You know, we adopt the mandate and then the mission goes off and now we move on as the Security Council to the next problem. And somehow the mission must hit the target. But that's not how it works in our world and when it comes to peace operations. Right? You need that continuous diplomatic engagement. You need our diplomats and our peacemakers need to continue to create a conducive environment politically in which the peace operation can be effective. And one of the main elements here is the importance of the host state. I think this is something will also come out prominently out of the new review that we are expecting in June. Because when you end up with only one country giving consent, we now are not back where the principles of peacekeeping, where the parties, all the parties to the conflict should give consent to the UN being there. We now, not even a party, but the host state is only one giving us consent. And then, obviously, with one party giving us consent, they have enormous influence and leverage on our ability to operate, on our freedom of movement, on the political situation. Because as I said, if they essentially want us to have to solve the problem, which they see as a problem of terrorism or insurgency, but they don't recognize the political problem and they don't want our help with the political problem, they don't want our interference, then we are in a very difficult situation where we don't have control over our strategy or over our exit. So I think this element of the host state, the relationship with the host state, is something very important. I think one thing we will see in this new review is talking about the idea of some form of, we can call it a compact. So when we adopt a Security Council resolution in a particular conflict, we also expect the host state or the parties to the conflict to agree on certain things. Yes, we will do a peacekeeping operation to achieve A, B, and C, but in order to do that, we expect you, as the host state, to do the following things, and then have some form of formal agreement between the host state or the parties to the conflict and the United Nations peacekeepers, so that it's very clear what the expectations are of both sides. I think this is something that we will see coming out of the new report. Shifting away from the nature of the conflict and how the nature of conflict has influenced us to adapt to peace operations, I want to just touch base on climate change and on new technology. So climate change has also had a very interesting impact on how we manage conflicts in three ways. It's impacting the nature of the conflict, so the reason why people are in conflict and how we deal with that. But it's also impacting on the ability of the peacekeeping operation to carry out its mandated tasks. Let me go through that. This is a map of the Lake Chad region. We have here the multinational joint task force, which is an operation of the region. But what I wanted to point out in this map is that you will see that in the middle of the map, where it's kind of a yellow color, the yellow there shows the area that is the worst affected by climate change or extreme weather through drought and floods. And you'll also see in that same area red spikes, which is where we have identified violent conflict incidents. And you'll also see gray circles, which are basically internally displaced people. And you will see the concentration of the internally displaced persons and the red spikes in the area that is also mostly affected by climate change. And this is because when people's livelihoods, their basic abilities to survive, is impacted by extreme weather events, by droughts, by flooding, they of course either feel they have to move or they find other ways of having to make a living. They have to start to compete with each other over the remaining places where there is water, or some people go into smuggling or other kind of what we would think of as, criminal or illegal activities. One important point I want to make here is that climate change doesn't cause conflict. People cause conflict, right? Climate change creates the environment that puts pressure, that puts stress on people, that may trigger some people to choose conflict. Most people choose to cooperate when they are under stress, including from climate change all over the world, which is why we don't see conflict everywhere where there's climate change. We are all affected by climate change, but we only see conflict in a few areas. Right? But in those areas where there is this link between climate change and conflict, it means that we as peacekeepers also have to take that into account in our analysis of the conflict, of who we deal with, of how we deal with it. But it also creates new protection problems. This is a photo from Bintu in South Sudan. This is the second largest city, a huge IDP camp in South Sudan. And this is a picture of a major dike, which our engineers are maintaining there. And if it wasn't for that dike, 400,000 people would be underwater. So we wouldn't think of it as the main task of a peacekeeping operation, to maintain a dike like this to protect an IDP population. But you can imagine the impact on the IDPs and the role of the peacekeepers if they are under flooding. So this is also kind of helping to deal with the extreme weather events, helping to deal with the natural disasters that come out as a result of climate change, is something which we are likely to increasingly have to deal with as peacekeepers as well. And then also in South Sudan, in Abyei, in other places where we have extreme flooding, it also means that our ability of our peacekeepers to reach the people that need protection, our access to people that need protection, are also being disrupted. So suddenly, normal infantry need to deploy with boats or need to find other ways of reaching those communities. And we have to change the way we think and we plan. For instance, in South Sudan, there's now a lot of focus before the flooding, because this is becoming now a seasonal norm, to identify the high-level areas, high-lying areas where people are likely to congregate when there's flooding, and to identify helicopter landing spots in those areas when we do need to either provide humanitarian assistance or to provide protection. So that kind of pre-planning, because we know of the results of climate change-related extreme weather events, is now becoming part of what peacekeeping operations do in these areas. And then I want to focus a little bit on new technologies. So we are all now more familiar with the influence of social media, which is now being accelerated by artificial intelligence. And this is also impacting United Nations peace operations. We find in many of our operations misinformation, disinformation that is consciously used by actors that want to disrupt the UN peacekeeping operation, is one of the ways and things that we need to now have an ability to counter. The photo here is of MONUSCO, the UN mission in the Congo, during 2022, when there was a lot of riots against the mission, and this was driven and passed by local politicians, national politicians, and others that have blamed the United Nations for the rise of the M23 and other various actions. A number of peacekeepers died as a result of this set of circumstances, and many ordinary people as well as a result of police action, Congolese police action. But the point is that this kind of mis and disinformation driving the perception that people have about UN peacekeeping is also a new phenomenon that we have to adapt to and to develop new technologies for. So we spoke about what do we need to adapt to, and I spoke about adapting to the nature of conflict. But the other thing we need to adapt to is the changing world order. Peace operations, as we know it, is really something that was developed since the birth of the United Nations, and over the last 80 years, UN peacekeeping has evolved. During most of that period, the United States was the sole power, the major power of the world, and during most of that period, the kind of Western liberal philosophy, ideology, was the dominant ideology in the world, and therefore UN peacekeeping operations also were essentially implementing that ideology in its peace operations. The photo here is of election support. So when we had these big multidimensional peacekeeping operations, part of the tasking of those missions was to help bring in democracy, political institutions that reflect these kind of institutions, equal rights, human rights, the role of women in gender equality, rule of law, free market system. All of this was part of what UN peace operations were also involved in. What I expected to be a major driver of change of peace operations right now was how, in a changing global order, countries like Brazil and China and South Africa and India and others would demand a different type of peacekeeping, one that is not simply replicating or imposing one particular set of values associated with the West, but either maybe not an alternative set of values, but in the context of a sense of coexistence, allowing states more to develop their own systems and their own institutions. So providing a more kind of a neutral support to capacity building, state capacity, training in more technical issues that are less value-driven from one particular ideology. And in fact, some research that we were conducting in that regard is what brought me also to Brasilia a couple of years ago, when we were looking at how do countries like Brazil and Russia and India and China and South Africa view peace operations, view peacemaking, view peace building. How do they see it different from what we can anticipate the West has brought about? But surprisingly, although we see a little bit of that, we've not seen a lot of pressure from countries, major troop contributing countries, the BRICS countries and others, on the nature of peacekeeping. What we found instead is that the major pressure of changing peacekeeping operations came from America or from the Trump administration. So this is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek image that somebody has produced on social media with President Trump seeing the Western Hemisphere as his, and then, of course, leaving other parts of the world to other major leaders. But in fact, although it's a joke, it's a good joke because it's based on reality, right? It's based on the new national strategy of the United States, which particularly see the world as being governed by major powers through bilateralism, not through multilateralism, not through cooperation, but sees the world and has a vision of managing the world as something that the major powers or powers that have influence should resolve amongst themselves through what we can call deal making. So we can also see where President Trump and his administration has been involved in making peace deals, whether it's in the Congo or in Azerbaijan or in Ukraine or various other places. The deal making is no longer about peace as a value in itself, but peace as a result of a profit motive, of an incentive, thinking that if both Rwanda and the DRC can benefit from the mining, then they will stop fighting, right? So it's a kind of a business incentive-driven idea of peace, rather than peace as a value, as a political value and obligation in itself. This has had a major impact on peace operations, both during the previous era when President Trump was in power, and of course now. We saw peacekeeping operations shrinking with about 40% during the first and second period of the Trump administration. If you look at the bottom left, dropping from 103,000 to barely 50,000 peacekeepers at the moment. And part of this is, politically, it's a decision not to use multilateralism as a solution, as a way of thinking about dealing with conflict in the world, but it's also financially, right? It's about shifting influencing the United Nations and shifting power by as you see in the bottom right, making sure less money is going to the United Nations and to peacekeeping operations. So these are the missions we are left with at the moment, 11 missions, of which only the bottom left 3 are large multidimensional peacekeeping operations. And of those, we know MONUSCO is likely to close down in the next 2 years or so, I would say, and MONUSCO and UNMISS are also not far behind. So we are likely, in a few years' time, to be left only with the ceasefire observer missions that most of them started during the 60s, the 50s and 60s. This is an important, helps to explain why the US has so much influence, because the US pays 26% of the UN peacekeeping budget based on a formula that is linked to gross domestic product. You'll see the China now pays about 23% since 2025. So between the two of them, they pay almost 50% of the UN peacekeeping budget. So if the US don't pay or pays very late, and China has paid very late the last 2 years, suddenly there's a huge financial impact and crisis in UN peacekeeping operations. In the African Union, we have I think an interesting model that I think the United Nations should consider. We have a couple of big economies like South Africa and Egypt and Morocco and Algeria and Nigeria, but we have a cap on the maximum amount those countries can contribute to the African Union budget of about, I think, 13%. That means that none of those countries as an individual country can have the major impact as an influence that a country like the United States can have in the UN system. So that's certainly something to look at. I want to take a moment just to say also that although we see this major disruption of President Trump and the US approach to managing the world, I think we are also now reaching a point where we can see many of these initiatives floundering. And one can imagine some changing adaptations happening as well. So on the top, after I think the intervention in Venezuela, the US really thought everything is possible, or I would say the Trump administration really thought everything is possible. But then we saw the challenge that was given to the US from especially its NATO members around Greenland. We have seen the challenges with the Gaza peace process. This is the model of the Riviera on the Gaza that the Board of Peace, President Trump, is putting forward. We all know the reality of Gaza and how different it looks. But we can also see that that idea is not coming to fruition. I mean, if we just go back to peace operations, the International Stabilization Force for Gaza is not being formed because it lacks the basics of what we understand has evolved around UN peacekeeping: a clear mandate, rules of engagement, a way to generate forces, a way to support the forces, clarity about what the rules of engagement will be, in this case, in terms of forceful disarmament of Hamas or not, amongst the peacekeepers. And so the mission is just not coming off the ground because it's lacking these basic elements of what we know is needed for the United Nations peacekeeping or any peacekeeping around the world to work. We see the Board of Peace is not really being established beyond the few countries that have to be part of it because of the Gaza peace process. The rest of the world is not coming to the table. And of course, I think we've also seen in the Strait of Hormuz now the limits of US influence and US power. So perhaps this helps a little bit to restrain the impact that we can expect from the Trump administration on multilateralism and therefore also on peacekeeping over the next coming years, but we'll have to see. So what does this mean in terms of the future of peace operations? I would say we've already seen, and I've shown you the figures, a major contraction of peacekeeping operations since 2014, a shift to special political missions, and we can expect also in the medium term continued conservative outlook around peacekeeping operations. The world is changing. People are uncertain about how to manage that. So we don't see the room for major new UN peacekeeping operations. Nobody is coming to the UN Security Council and say, we need a peacekeeping operation in Gaza. We need a peacekeeping operation when it comes to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. People are looking at other alternatives at this stage that are more politically safe in this current space. So I think we will largely end up with the current ceasefire observer missions, perhaps some new operations in the medium period. You never know, there could be a particular crisis that erupts. Haiti is a good example where, despite all the larger developments, the US is increasingly turning back to the United Nations for support, for solutions, and it could be the kind of place where you may find that the United Nations is the only type of operation that you may find is feasible amongst accepted for the member states, even for a country like the US. But in the longer term, I think it's important. I think the United Nations and UN peacekeeping will remain important. The United Nations peacekeeping, is the sole place where we all come together. It is the symbol of international cooperation, also physically through the blue helmets, through the various troop contributing countries operating side by side. And I see eventually there will be as we've seen in the past with peace operations again, a period where we will see more prominent peacekeeping operations again in future, and a more prominent role for peace operations in the future. It'll be different, as we've seen with the adaptations over time. At the same time, I think it will essentially have the identity of peacekeeping as we see it now. I've run out of time, but I just want to quickly end off with reflections on how do we think about peace operations or adaptive peace operations, not just as something we react to, but as something which is maybe a pre-thought-out doctrine. And to do that, we need to think about and understand that the world we live in is not a machine, it's not a mechanism. Maybe many of you are engineers. I know that engineering is a very strong element and dimension of training in military schools. And therefore, we have a lot of engineering thinking when it comes to dealing also with peace. But it's very important to understand that societies, communities, social systems differ significantly from the way a machine operates. And this graph basically gives you some of the key differences. I'm not going to go to it in major detail, except to say that it is extremely challenging to build a rocket and to send it to space, send it around the moon like we've recently seen, right? It takes a lot of knowledge and a lot of engineering, but once you've done it, once you've achieved it, you can do it again and again with a fairly good sense of success. When it comes to peace, we may have been successful in a certain place, in Liberia, at a certain time, at a certain moment, but there's no guarantee that we can do the same thing in another place and have the same effect. So the non-linearity of these situations is the basic reality that we need to understand to deal with the uncertainty, the unpredictability of each different peace process. Each process is unique, is a particular context, and therefore we need to find a solution for each place. It also means that is why it's not possible for me or you to figure out how best to solve the conflict in Palestine or in Ukraine. It is for the people of Ukraine and Russia and Palestine and Israel to resolve those conflicts in their own context with themselves. We can support that process as international mediators, but we cannot replicate it. We can't take the success of the transition in South Africa, for instance, and transplant it in Israel and in Gaza. That's the basic core lesson of understanding the system we're dealing with when we talk about peace. And that is why, instead of having a pre-designed solution, we need to develop an adaptive solution in each case we're dealing with. It means we need to look at the context. The solution needs to come from the people themselves, has to be participatory. We can just play a role in supporting that process. We cannot, as the UN or as anyone, impose a peace on those people. And we need to continuously adapt, which means we experiment with things, we learn from what we're doing, and we try things again, because the next step is always uncertain. One of the things which is different from engineering to the reality of peace is that if something is working today, it's unlikely to keep working a few months from now, because there are people who are figuring out and who are spoilers, who are not agreeing, who are benefiting from the conflict, and they'll figure out what you're doing, and they will adapt and do things differently, right? So that is why you need a continuous process of adaptation and learning when you deal with peace. And so that is why I think it's important to think about adaptation, adaptive peace operations also as a doctrine. And I just wanted to give you an example of one place where we've done that. This is the Comprehensive Performance Assessment System for United Nations Peacekeeping Operations. So it's a system we developed in 2018 using these ideas of adaptation and complexity, so that peacekeeping operations can themselves identify where are they effective, where are they not effective, and then make adaptations to how we use people and how we use resources to try and make those peace operations more effective. If we don't know where we are effective and why, we are not able to adapt and to change what we are doing so that we can continue to be more and more effective in future. With that, I want to thank you. Thanks for your patience. And I hope this talk has helped to kick off our discussion over the next day and a half. Thank you very much.